The wind of Colorado territory blew dry and hollow that day, carrying dust and whispers from the far mesas. The grass crackled underfoot, and the sky hung wide and merciless over miles of open range. Down the rutted road came a small figure wrapped in a faded wool shawl. Awanata, daughter of an Apache healer, and the last of her kin still living near White Lands. Her moccasins were cracked, her hands calloused from travel, but her gaze held the calm of someone who had already faced loss and kept walking. In the distance, Oakley Ranch rose like a fortress, white fences, tall barns, and a 2-story house standing proud against the mountains. It was a world of order and discipline, built by men who believed they owned the land they fenced. To Awanata, it looked both beautiful and cruel. She stopped at the gate, brushed the dust from her skirt, and whispered a prayer in her mother's tongue. "Let me find a place, even among strangers." Inside, the smell of wood smoke and horse sweat drifted through the air. A hired hand looked up from a wagon, scowling. "You lost, Indian girl?" Awanata straightened her shoulders. "I'm looking for work. The kitchen, maybe." The man spat into the dirt. "Kitchen's full." Before he could turn away, a voice sharper than a knife rang out from the porch. "That'll do, Mr. Duffy." It was Mrs. Perkins, the housekeeper, a stern, narrow-faced woman wrapped in a black shawl, gray hair pinned tight. Her eyes scanned Awanata from head to toe, not cruel, but cold as the morning frost. "You can cook?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me. Bread, stews, and pie." "Pie?" Mrs. Perkins raised a skeptical brow. "What kind?" "Apple," Awanata said softly, "with maple and ginger. Sweet enough to remember home." For a moment, the older woman hesitated, then sighed. "The master's in Denver. We're short-handed. You'll take the servants' room behind the kitchen. Work starts before sunrise." Awanata nodded gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am." She stepped inside the grand ranch house, boots leaving faint prints on the polished wood floor. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that made even footsteps sound too loud. Portraits of men on horseback lined the walls, faces proud, unyielding, and utterly foreign to her. That night, she unpacked her few belongings, a small pouch of dried herbs, a wooden spoon worn smooth from her mother's hand, and a folded scrap of paper with a recipe written in both English and Apache. 1 cup of sliced apple, 1 spoon of maple, a touch of fire, and a prayer for love. She traced the letters with her fingertips, the edges soft from years of handling. The bunkhouse walls creaked in the wind. Somewhere outside, a coyote called into the darkness, and the echo answered across the canyon. Awanata lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling beams. She could still feel the weight of Mrs. Perkins' measuring gaze, still hear the mockery in the ranch hand's voice. Yet under it all, she sensed something else, something she couldn't name. Waiting in the silence of the big house, she whispered again into the night, "Mother, if I must be among them, let me bring a little of our warmth to their cold." Outside, the wind carried her words away, sweeping them across the dry plains toward the snow-peaked mountains. And though she didn't know it yet, that simple wish, spoken in the language of her ancestors, had already begun to stir the heart of the man who would one day taste her apple pie and find his life forever changed. The dust hadn't settled from the Denver stagecoach when Ethan Oakley stepped down, boots crunching against the hard-packed road. The man had built an empire out of nothing but cattle, grit, and sleepless nights. Folks called him the man who could outstare the sun. And most days, that was true. His eyes were sharp, glacier blue, the kind that saw profit, weakness, and lies in one glance. But that evening, the mountain wind hit different, cold enough to remind him that success didn't keep a man warm. The trip to Denver had been a bust. The railroad barons refused to build a spur line to his ranch. Without it, every season meant more lost profit and more long rides to market. Ethan wasn't a man who liked losing, and the weight of failure rode him like a saddle that didn't fit. He climbed into his carriage and stared down the long stretch of land that carried his name. Oakley Ranch, one of the largest in Colorado Territory. Yet even from that height, the loneliness felt endless. Inside the big house, Mrs. Perkins met him at the door, spine straight as a fence post. "Welcome home, Mr. Oakley," she said crisply. "Dinner will be ready soon. We've taken on a new kitchen girl while you were gone." "Fine," he muttered, handing off his hat. "I'm not much for surprises tonight." But later that evening, surprise found him anyway. The dining hall glowed with lamplight, long shadows flickering over portraits of long-dead Oakleys. As he ate, voices drifted faintly from the kitchen, the soft clatter of pans, a low hum of someone singing. It wasn't one of the usual songs the staff knew. It was lower, older, something that rolled like wind through canyon stone. Ethan paused his fork mid-air when he stepped quietly to the doorway. He saw her, the Apache girl, bent over the hearth, coaxing the fire to life. The flame painted her skin gold, outlining the strength in her arms and the grace in every movement. Her dark hair slipped loose from its braid, catching the light like silk. She wasn't pretty the way city women were, but there was something wild and unyielding about her that made his chest tighten. "Who's that?" he asked Mrs. Perkins quietly. "The new kitchen girl," she replied. "Awanata. Says she can cook." Ethan didn't answer. He just watched as Awanata lifted a pot, her expression calm and focused, like she was in prayer. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet fire that dared the world to look away first. When she turned slightly, the lamplight caught her face, and for a single heartbeat, their eyes met. His blue, hers dark and endless as riverstone. It was over in a second. She looked down again, back to her work, and Ethan stepped away, unsure why his pulse had quickened. He told himself it was nothing, just curiosity. A man notices things, smells, sounds, people, that's all. But lying in bed later, he couldn't shake the image. The way she stood between fire and shadow, the way her song had filled the room with something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, maybe, or longing. He turned on his side and exhaled slowly, staring at the moonlight spilling through the window. Outside, the coyotes were calling, lonely and haunting. Inside, the house felt too big for one man. Ethan Oakley had fought droughts, debt, and every storm the frontier could throw at him. But that night, as the wind rattled the windows, he realized he'd never faced anything quite as unsettling as the thought of a brown-eyed Apache girl humming by his kitchen fire. And somewhere deep down, beneath all his iron and order, something had already begun to bend. The mornings came early at Oakley Ranch, long before the sun touched the peaks. Smoke from the kitchen chimney rose into the pale light like a slow prayer, and inside, Awanata worked in silence. The world beyond those thick adobe walls could say what it pleased. Inside, she had her rhythm. Knead, stir, breathe. She knew that the secret to a good loaf wasn't the flour or the heat. It was the patience of the hands that shaped it. Cook, a round woman with cheeks flushed from years by the stove, took to Awanata right away. "You've got a quiet way about you," she'd say, wiping her hands on her apron. "But you listen better than most who talk twice as much." Cook treated her kindly, slipping her an extra biscuit or sharing stories about her late husband, who'd been a railroad worker before his back gave out. The others, stable boys, maids, ranch hands, kept their distance. Some nodded politely, most just looked away. To them, she wasn't one of them. Not white, not city, not the kind they'd ever sit with at supper. Still, Awanata stayed steady. Her hands were quick, her mind quicker. She learned which knives Cook trusted, which pans gave the right crust, and how to move through the crowded kitchen without bumping a soul. By the end of her second week, even Mrs. Perkins had stopped scowling every time she entered. One afternoon, as the sun burned low over the hills, the kitchen buzzed with gossip. Martha, the laundry girl, came rushing in with her arms full of linens and her voice full of mischief. "They say the Hendersons are coming from Denver. 3 whole days they'll stay. And their daughter, Caroline..." She leaned closer, grinning. "Pretty as a painted picture and rich as the governor himself." Cook snorted. "Rich don't make a woman worth a damn if she can't boil an egg." Martha lowered her voice, but her excitement stayed. "Word is, Mr. Henderson's been wanting to tie her to Mr. Oakley. A real fine match, folks say." The rolling pin stilled under Awanata's palms. Her breath caught, though her face betrayed nothing. Cook shot Martha a look. "Enough talk. You'll spoil the dough with all that wind from your mouth." But even Cook's voice softened when she turned to Awanata. "Don't mind the chatter, girl. Men like Mr. Oakley, they live in a different world." Awanata only nodded, pressing her palms deep into the dough, feeling its warmth push back against her skin. That evening, after the supper rush died down, she lingered by the window, looking out across the dark fields. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, the air thick with the scent of smoke and horses. Somewhere out there, the man they all spoke of rode home through the twilight. Ethan Oakley, the rancher with eyes cold as the mountain snow. She had seen him once, just a glimpse through the kitchen door. A tall figure framed by lamplight, moving with the sure stride of a man who knew his land and himself. He hadn't looked her way, and that was fine. Men like him didn't see women like her. Still, when she thought of him, she felt something strange and small stir deep inside. Not longing, not jealousy, something quieter. A reminder that even in the strongest heart, there are places left unguarded. The wind whistled through the chimney, scattering ash across the fire. Cook's snores echoed softly from her cot in the corner. Awanata closed her eyes and let the sound of the crackling fire fill her ears. Tomorrow, the rich girl would arrive, and the house would come alive with chatter and perfume. The men would polish their boots, the women their manners. But Awanata would do what she always did: knead, stir, breathe, and hope that somewhere between the smoke and the silence, the world would remember she was more than what they saw. By the time the Henderson family's carriage rolled up the drive, Oakley Ranch had turned into a battlefield of pots, flour, and nerves. The clang of pans echoed off the stone walls, and Cook barked orders like a general in a war she didn't intend to lose. "Keep them biscuits from burnin', Martha. And for heaven's sake, someone stir that stew before it crawls out the pot." Awanata worked quietly through the chaos, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back with a strip of rawhide. Her hands moved with calm precision, unbothered by the commotion. She had grown up learning that stillness was power, the ability to move like water even when storms raged around you. That morning, Cook shoved a basket of apples across the table. "You're good with your hands, girl. Think you can manage dessert tonight?" Awanata nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll make apple pie." "Apple pie? Don't get fancy now. These city folks like their food plain and proper." Awanata smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with something between defiance and memory. It'll be plain enough, ma'am. Just the way my mother taught me." When the kitchen cleared for a moment, she went to work. She peeled each apple thin as a whisper, mixing them with wild honey, ginger, and a drizzle of maple syrup Cook had tucked away in the pantry. The smell filled the room, sweet, earthy, and alive. It reminded her of autumns on Apache land, when her mother baked with what little they had, turning hunger into comfort. As the crust browned in the oven, the scent drifted out into the hall, curling its way toward the front of the house. That's where Ethan Oakley caught it. He was crossing the foyer, jacket slung over one shoulder, when the aroma stopped him cold. He stood there, head tilted slightly, as if trying to place it. It wasn't the polite sweetness of the usual desserts he'd known from Denver. This was something warmer, something human. Following the scent, he pushed through the kitchen door and found her, Awanata, bent over the oven door, checking the pie. The fire painted her face in gold, her expression calm and sure. "What's that smell?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Awanata straightened slowly, startled but composed. "Apple pie," she said softly. "My mother's way." He took a step closer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "Maple and something else?" "Ginger," she answered, "for warmth." Cook spun around from the sink, wiping her hands hastily. "Mr. Oakley, didn't hear you come in, sir. Dinner'll be ready soon." But Ethan didn't move. He was still watching Awanata, and for a strange moment the kitchen seemed to shrink until only the two of them existed. The man of iron and the girl of earth. He reached forward as if drawn by instinct and broke off a small piece of the crust she held on a fork. It was still warm. The flavor hit him like a memory. Tart apples, smoke, sweetness, and something else he couldn't name. Something that felt like home. "You said your mother taught you?" "Yes," Awanata said. "She said a pie should feed more than the stomach. It should remind the heart it's still alive." He looked down at her, and for the first time in a long while, the hard lines in his face softened. Seems she knew what she was doing. Cook cleared her throat loudly, shattering the moment. "We'd best get back to it, sir. Guests'll be expectin' supper." Ethan nodded reluctantly. "Carry on." As he left, he glanced back once, catching the flicker of her smile before she turned away. He told himself it was nothing. Just a good pie. Just a kind face. But when he stepped into the cold hallway, the smell of apple and smoke clung to him like a ghost that refused to fade. That night, long after the Hendersons had arrived and the ranch quieted down, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound of laughter from the parlor drifted through the floorboards, but his mind was still in the kitchen, with the girl who baked memories into her pie. And though he didn't yet know it, that single taste had changed the course of his life. That night, Oakley Ranch looked like something out of a Denver newspaper, lamps blazing in every window, laughter spilling through the halls, and the clink of silverware echoing off polished walls. The Hendersons had arrived in full fashion. Mr. Henderson, with his booming voice and cigar smoke. Monsieur Henderson dripping with pearls, and their daughter Caroline, in a gown so blue it could make the sky jealous. Awanata stayed where she belonged, behind the kitchen door. The servants scurried in and out like bees, balancing trays of roast beef, candied yams, and bread still steaming from the oven. But when her pie came out of the oven, even Cook went quiet for a second. The smell was something no recipe book could explain. Apples, maple, and wild honey, mingled with a faint spice of ginger and the smoke from the wood stove. It filled the kitchen, then the hallway, and before long, drifted straight into the grand dining room like a spell. When the dessert was finally served, the chatter at the table faded. Forks clinked, then stilled. Someone whispered, "What is that flavor?" Another murmured, "It's not like any apple pie I've ever tasted." Ethan Oakley, sitting at the head of the table, said nothing. He just watched their faces, then took a bite himself. The taste hit him like a memory. His mother's laughter, the smell of home before the hard years came. For a heartbeat, he wasn't the rancher or the businessman. He was just a man remembering what peace felt like. Across the table, Mr. Henderson raised a brow, impressed. "Well, I'll be damned. That pie could settle a man's temper better than a bottle of bourbon." Laughter returned to the room, but Ethan didn't join in. He was thinking about the girl who had baked it. Later that night, when cigars were lit and the women retreated to the parlor, Mr. Henderson clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "You know, Oakley, I've been thinking." Ethan gave him a wary look. "That usually means trouble." "No trouble at all. You've been chasing that railroad contract for months, haven't you? Well, consider it done. I'll send a word to my man at the line." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "That's generous of you, George, but I thought—" "You thought I wanted you to marry my daughter," Henderson said with a wink. "Turns out she's got her eyes on some surgeon in Denver, so you're off the hook." Ethan chuckled softly. "Then what changed your mind?" Henderson leaned in, his grin half hidden by cigar smoke. "That pie did what diplomacy couldn't." The words stuck with Ethan long after the guests had gone, and the last light in the house had dimmed. He found himself walking toward the kitchen, though he couldn't say why. The place was quiet now, just the crackle of the dying fire. Awanata sat at the wooden table, her back straight, polishing a pan by lamplight. When she looked up, her eyes caught his. "You're still awake," he said softly. "The pans don't clean themselves," she replied with a small smile. He hesitated in the doorway, searching for something to say, and finding only honesty. "They talked about your pie all night." She shrugged lightly. "It's only apples and sugar, Mr. Oakley." "No," he said. "It's something else, something I haven't tasted in a long time." For a moment, silence hung between them. Comfortable, fragile, alive. The man of iron and the girl of earth, standing on opposite sides of the same warmth. Then he nodded, half smiling. "Good night, Miss Awanata. Good night, Mr. Oakley." When he turned and walked away, she watched the door close behind him, wondering why her heart beat faster than the ticking clock. Outside, the wind shifted over the plains, carrying the faint smell of apples and smoke, a scent that would linger in both their memories long after the night was gone. Snow came early that year. It gathered thick along the fences and roof lines, softening even the hard edges of the Oakley ranch. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, the kind of stillness that makes a man hear his own thoughts too loud. Inside, the kitchen glowed with warmth. Awanata worked by the fire, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for the next morning's bread. The wind moaned outside, but in that small room, the world felt far away. When Ethan Oakley stepped through the door, the cold followed him like a shadow. He removed his gloves, shaking snow from his hat. "Evenin', Miss Awanata." She looked up, startled but calm. "Evenin', Mr. Oakley. You should be by the fire in the parlor, not here." He smiled faintly, his breath still white in the air. "Truth is, the parlor's too quiet. I came to talk about the Christmas meals. Thought maybe you'd help me plan the menu." Awanata wiped her hands on her apron and nodded. "Of course. Mrs. Perkins said we'd have guests." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "Yes. My old foreman and his family. Good folks. I'd like to make it special." She began jotting notes on a scrap of paper. "Roast turkey, spiced cider, And maybe pie, if we have enough apples left." "Apple pie," he said, half smiling. "Your mother's way?" She looked up, surprised that he remembered. "Yes, sir. Her way." Silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the warmth between them deepened. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter now. "My mother used to bake too. Only thing that could settle my father after a long drive. She passed when I was 16. Influenza took her and my father both in the same week." He said it simply, but the words hung heavy in the air. Awanata's eyes softened. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her fingers lightly over his hand. Her touch was gentle, reverent, as if she were blessing something sacred. Then she spoke, soft, rhythmic syllables in her native Apache tongue. "Goda che da shiube, nida du shash, du shiube nahodute." May their spirits walk in light and remember warmth. Ethan didn't understand the words, but he felt them. The sound wrapped around him like the scent of her pies, earthy, human, and honest. For a moment, the distance between them disappeared. They weren't rancher and servant, white and Apache. Just two people who knew loss too well. When she realized her hand still rested on his, she pulled back quickly, cheeks coloring. "Forgive me, sir. It wasn't my place." "No," he said softly, catching her eyes. "It was kindness. The world could use more of that." The door creaked suddenly, and Mrs. Perkins appeared, her expression carved from stone. "Mr. Oakley," she said sharply, "the solicitor from Denver has arrived." "Thank you," he answered evenly. As the older woman turned her gaze to Awanata, her meaning was clear without words. Know your place. When Ethan left, the kitchen felt colder than before. Awanata stood for a long while staring at the fire, her heartbeat still uneven. The flame flickered, shadows dancing across the walls like restless ghosts. She whispered under her breath, the words lost in the crackle of burning logs. "There are boundaries even fire cannot cross," but deep inside her chest, where warmth and danger met, she already knew. Whatever line had once divided them had been crossed, and there was no going back. Winter deepened, swallowing the plains in silence. The world outside the ranch had turned white and still, but inside, the creak of timbers and hiss of wind through the shutters reminded everyone that the cold had teeth. One morning, a pipe burst in the main kitchen, flooding the floor and sending Cook into a fit that could have woken the dead. The water froze quick as glass. Ethan ordered repairs, but it meant the big kitchen had to be shut down for days. That's when he turned to Awanata. "The old summer kitchen out back still has a good stove," he said. "It'll be cold work, but you've got a steady hand. Think you can manage?" She nodded without hesitation. "I've worked in colder places, Mr. Oakley." The summer kitchen sat apart from the main house, its stone walls rough and smoke-stained from years of use. The wind slipped through every crack, but Awanata lit a fire anyway, wrapping herself in a thick shawl and getting to work. The warmth from the stove kissed her cheeks red as she experimented with recipes. Sweet bread spiced with ginger, apple tarts folded with maple syrup, even a stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. When Ethan came to check on her that evening, the air was sharp with frost. He pushed open the heavy door, and light spilled out onto the snow. Inside, the little kitchen glowed. Awanata was bent over the oven, brushing melted butter over a loaf. The fire painted her face in shades of gold and ember. For a long moment, Ethan just watched, something tightening in his chest. "I came to see if the stove's holding," he said, his voice catching on the edge of the truth. "It's holding fine. she answered softly, without turning. "But the wind keeps testing it." He smiled at that, quiet, thoughtful. "Wind has a way of testing everything, I suppose." When she finally turned to face him, their eyes met in the flickering light. There was no distance now, no barrier of words or station. Just two souls caught in the stillness between heartbeats. The door creaked behind them, breaking the spell. Sarah Miller, wife of Ethan's old foreman, stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. "Mercy, it's warm in here," she laughed. "I thought you'd both turn to ice." Ethan straightened, clearing his throat. "Sarah, I didn't expect you out in this weather." "I came to drop off some letters from town," she said. "And to say, well, to say something I probably shouldn't." Her eyes flicked to Awanata, then back to Ethan. "Years ago, you asked my husband if it was wrong to love an Apache girl." The words dropped like stones in still water. Awanata froze, her breath catching in her throat. Sarah smiled faintly. "He told me that story once. Said he never saw you look so lost for an answer." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver from Awanata's. Sarah excused herself gently, slipping back into the night with a knowing look. Silence filled the kitchen again. Only this time, it was heavier, fuller. "Was it true?" Awanata whispered. Ethan took a step closer, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Yes," he said, "and I no longer care if the world calls it wrong." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, tears trembling like glass before they fell. The look on his face wasn't one of pity or rebellion. It was something older, deeper. He reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of his hand. For a moment, they simply stood there, surrounded by snow, fire, and the scent of bread. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen plains, but inside the summer kitchen, the world was warm again. By the time the thaw came, the whispers had already spread farther than the wind. From the trading post to the church steps, tongues wagged like loose shutters in a storm. They said Ethan Oakley, the proud rancher of the northern plains, had been bewitched. Put under an Indian spell, they called it. Men spat the words over whiskey glasses. Women muttered them behind gloved hands. "He's gone soft," they said. "That Apache girl's got her claws in him." At first, Awanata tried to ignore it, but gossip has a way of finding ears it doesn't belong to. One gray morning, she went to town to trade for flour and lard. The boardwalk was slick with melted snow, the air sharp with gossip and smoke. As she walked past the general store, two women in bright bonnets stopped talking and turned toward her. "Well, look who's come to town," one of them said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Guess Oakley's too busy to send his pet Savage for supplies," the other added, laughing. Awanata kept her chin high, her steps steady, but the words stung all the same. Before she could reach the door, a familiar voice cut through the winter air. "That's enough." The laughter died instantly. Ethan stood at the end of the street, coat unbuttoned, boots caked with slush, eyes like blue steel. He walked straight toward them, his shadow long across the snow. "You call her Savage," he said quietly, "but she's the only civilized heart I've ever met." The two women flushed red, their smiles fading fast. They muttered apologies and hurried away, skirts rustling. The street fell silent except for the crunch of Ethan's boots as he stopped in front of Awanata. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he took the sack of flour from her hands. "You shouldn't have to face them alone," he said. "I've faced worse," she replied softly. "But not for this reason." He looked down at her, snow falling between them like ash. "They can say what they want. I know the truth." That night, the wind returned, cold and restless. Awanata was in the summer kitchen, stoking the fire when she heard footsteps in the snow. She turned as Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face lit by firelight and stormlight both. He said nothing at first, only pulled something from his pocket, a silver band etched with an eagle feather, the symbol of freedom and love among her people. "Awanata," he said, voice low, "will you walk this world with me?" Tears welled in her eyes, half from fear, half from joy. The world outside would never forgive this. She knew it as sure as she knew her own name. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she laid it against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath. "Two souls," she whispered. "One fire." Ethan smiled, slipping the band into her palm. Outside, the snow fell in thick silence, blanketing the ranch in a quiet kind of peace. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The land, the wind, even the stars, as if listening to a promise made not in words, but in the language of hearts brave enough to burn in the cold. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a song of warning, or maybe of blessing. Either way, the night answered back. The summer of 1884 arrived with the smell of dust, the heat of the sun, and the promise of change. Oakley Ranch, once a place where iron and stone had forged a man's legacy, was now ready to witness a different kind of union. Not one born from business, but from something more elemental, more alive. The wedding wasn't grand, nor was it bound by the trappings of city society. There were no fancy carriages, no grand ballroom or velvet chairs. It was held beneath the shade of an ancient cottonwood tree, its gnarled roots stretching deep into the earth as if it had been waiting for this day for centuries. Ethan Oakley stood by the tree's wide trunk, his boots planted firm on the dry grass. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, his face as serious as a man about to commit to the most important part of his life. But his eyes, they were soft when they looked toward Awanata. Her dress was simple too, white cotton, sewn by Cook and a few of the ranch women, with touches of turquoise beads around the collar and cuffs, the symbol of her Apache heritage. She held a wreath of eagle feathers mixed with wildflowers in her hands, the colors a contrast to the browns and greens of the land surrounding them. The guests, Ethan's ranch hands, the Miller family, Cook, and a few other townfolk, gathered around, seated on hay bales and blankets in the shade. There was no preacher, no formal ceremony, just the drumbeat of Apache rhythm echoing in the air, weaving between the twangs of a banjo played by Thomas Miller, Ethan's old foreman. As the music began, Awanata stepped forward, her gaze never wavering from Ethan's. She looked like the sun itself, a piece of the land in her. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her, feeling the weight of all the words he never knew how to speak until now. Awanata reached him, the crowd falling into a quiet reverence. She placed her hands in his, the familiar warmth of his touch grounding her. The world around them seemed to shrink, leaving only the cottonwood tree, the music, and the promise in their eyes. At that moment, Cook's voice rang out from the back, her hands on her hips as she surveyed the scene. "That pie started all this, you know." Ethan chuckled softly, glancing at Awanata. She laughed too, the sound like a breeze over the plains. Ethan's voice, low and warm, reached her. No, her heart did. Awanata's eyes glistened, a mixture of laughter and tears. She had known the hardships, the rumors, the judgment from others. But in this moment, none of it mattered. She had found a place in this world, not as an outsider, but as a partner. As they exchanged vows, the wind picked up, whispering through the cottonwood's leaves like an old story. Ethan promised to protect, to share, to grow with her. Awanata promised to honor the land, the love they shared, and the family they would build. There were no fancy words, no legal contracts, just the sacred bond forged between them and the earth beneath their feet. After the vows were exchanged, Ethan gently took her hand and slid a silver band with the engraving of an eagle feather onto her finger. His promise, bound by tradition and heart. The crowd erupted into applause, and the celebration began in earnest. The banjo's strings sang into the late afternoon, feet kicked up in laughter, and stories flowed as freely as the whiskey. The ranch hands danced with the women, old and young, as the sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land. As the evening wore on, Ethan and Awanata stood side by side, watching their new life unfold in the glow of firelight. There were no more boundaries between them. She was no longer the Apache girl, and he was no longer the rancher. Together they were simply two souls, walking side by side, as one. Years had passed since the wedding beneath the cottonwoods, and the Oakley ranch had grown quieter, settled into a rhythm like the earth itself. But in the whispers of the wind and the rustling of the leaves, the story of Ethan Oakley and Awanata lived on, carried in the hearts of those who had known them, and in the very walls of the house they'd made their home. It was said that a pair of hands, hers, with the grace of the earth, his with the strength of iron, had turned something as simple as apple pie into a symbol of unity, not just between two people, but between two worlds. The fire that had started between them burned in the hearts of everyone who walked through that ranch, whether they wore boots of leather or moccasins of hide. By then, the ranch had become a meeting place where children of all colors learned the art of cooking side by side. Awanata taught them how to knead bread with care, to add the right pinch of spice, and most of all, to listen to the stories carried by the food. They learned not just to cook, but to share. Ethan, always standing by her side, saw the beauty in the way their family had been formed. Not by blood, but by choice, by love. In the old kitchen, the one that had once been Awanata's domain, hung a recipe framed in wood. The paper was yellowed with time, the edges frayed from the many hands that had touched it. On it, in Ethan's handwriting, were the words, "She taught me that love, like apple pie, needs only honest hands and a brave heart." Those words had become gospel in the house. It was a simple thing, a recipe passed from one generation to the next, but it was more than just food. It was the foundation of their family, a testament to the strength of two hearts that had refused to be divided by the lines drawn by society. The children, now older and carrying their own families, still remembered the nights when they sat by the fire, listening to the tales of the rancher who chose love over rumors. They could still feel the warmth of the pies, fresh from the oven, the scent that brought everything together. And each of them, whether they were Apache or settler, savored that memory, knowing that it wasn't the food that made them family. It was the act of sharing it, of understanding that despite the world outside, there was always a place for love, for kindness, and for honesty. Awanata and Ethan, now older, still worked side by side. His hair had turned silver, and her skin had weathered the years like the leather of an old saddle, but their hearts had only grown stronger with time. They no longer needed to speak of their past struggles, for their lives together had told that story. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, they sat together on the porch of their home. The land stretched out before them, wild and free, and behind them, the house stood, its walls echoing with memories. Ethan turned to Awanata, his weathered hand resting over hers. "You ever think about how it all started?" She smiled, her eyes soft, the same warmth in them as when she had first made that pie. I think about it every day. They sat in silence, the world around them still, as the sun faded and the stars began to twinkle overhead. Their lives had been hard, but they had lived them well, together, as one. The legacy of the pie had woven them into something greater than they could have ever imagined. And in the quiet of that moment, they knew they had done more than just build a ranch. They had built a home,